The Oakwood Plaza Mall, a sprawling maze of polished floors and glass windows, buzzed with its usual Saturday afternoon activity. Shoppers milled about, their voices a soft hum of weekend conversations, punctuated by the occasional laughter of children as they darted between stores, tugging at the hands of distracted parents. The faint aroma of freshly baked pretzels and cinnamon drifted through the air, creating the comforting, familiar scent of a Saturday outing. For most, it was a day of minor indulgences, picking up the week's groceries, browsing the latest fashion, perhaps even grabbing a quick snack at the food court before returning to the monotony of daily life. But in that moment, the mundane was about to be shattered, though no one knew it yet. The automatic doors of the mall opened with a soft hiss, and the usual crowd barely took notice. It was just another shopper, right? But then there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a slight pause in the rhythm of footsteps, a shared glance as the newcomer stepped through. He was different, something about him stood out. It wasn't just the sharpness of his black blazer or the relaxed fit of his jeans. It wasn't even the polished way he carried himself, as though he owned every inch of space he stepped into. No, what made the moment unusual was something far less subtle: the red MAGA hat perched firmly atop his head. It didn't take long for whispers to ripple through the crowd. The man didn't look like your typical mall goer. His purposeful stride, the slightly aloof expression on his face, the sharpness in his eyes, it was all a perfect blend of intrigue. He didn't belong to the crowd, and yet he belonged to everyone's eye. Some wondered if he was a celebrity, while others instinctively pulled out their phones, attempting to capture a snapshot of him as if he was some rare, exotic animal. One teenage boy standing by the fountain squinted at him, his eyes narrowing as he fumbled for his phone. "Is that Elon Musk?" he asked his friend, voice barely audible over the buzz of mall chatter. His friend, too, was already fumbling with his phone, trying to capture the moment. They exchanged confused glances, both struggling to reconcile the presence of one of the world's most famous entrepreneurs in a seemingly ordinary shopping mall in Lexington, Kentucky. Why would he be here? What was he doing? The thought nagged at them, but before they could ask more questions, the man had already slipped past them, moving with deliberate ease toward the electronics kiosk. A few moments later, the ripples of speculation grew, reaching other shoppers. The crowd's gaze subtly shifted toward him. It was as if they had all collectively decided to pay attention, to try to figure out what exactly was going on. The man walked with confidence, not rushing, but not lingering either. His eyes scanned the mall, seemingly unaffected by the growing awareness of his presence. He wasn't just another customer, not a run-of-the-mill weekend shopper. At one point, he stopped in front of a display of drones at the electronics kiosk, eyeing them with casual curiosity. He leaned in for a closer look, his fingers gently tapping on the glass casing of the display. The small crowd that had gathered around the area whispered among themselves, some of them nodding knowingly, others just as unsure as the teenage boys who had started the buzz. Was it really him? Could it be? Elon Musk, of all people, walking the aisles of a mall in Kentucky, as if he had nowhere else to be. It seemed almost absurd. The employees at the kiosk exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they should say something to the man, but no one moved. They all felt a mix of awe and hesitation. His presence, though calm and collected, was imposing in a way that seemed to paralyze the small, otherwise ordinary scene. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the air in the mall began to hum with a new kind of energy. The ordinary had slipped away, and now there was only the question of what would happen next. Who was this man? Why was he here? What did it mean that he was wearing that hat? The whispers spread like wildfire, bouncing from one person to the next. A few brave souls started to venture closer, peering over their shoulders, trying to get a better look without being too obvious. Was it really Elon Musk? Did he come to see something? Was this just a stunt? And why did he wear the MAGA hat in a mall, of all places? The questions piled on top of one another, creating an atmosphere charged with anticipation. At that moment, the man still inspecting the drones as though he had all the time in the world seemed unfazed by the growing attention. In fact, his only reaction to the growing crowd was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his gaze. He knew they were watching. He knew they were questioning. But still, he said nothing. He didn't seem bothered by it, as though his presence in the space had become his own reality, unaffected by the growing murmurs around him. Some people tried to ask him questions, polite inquiries about his thoughts on the technology, a few compliments on the hat, but he remained silent. His focus was elsewhere. The crowd grew, the murmurs intensifying. But all the while, the man remained rooted in place, seemingly oblivious to the spectacle he was creating. He moved again, this time heading deeper into the mall, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. He walked as though he belonged, as though he had a reason to be there. The crowd watched, some captivated, some curious, others anxious. What was happening here? Was this just a momentary spectacle, or something bigger? For all the attention his presence drew, for all the whispers and speculations that fluttered through the crowd, the man continued on his way, unaffected, unhurried. His gaze flitted across storefronts, and for a moment it almost felt as though he was just another shopper, another face in the crowd. Yet, the very fact that he was so unbothered, so composed, only added to the mystique of the situation. Was this some kind of performance? A joke? Or had Elon Musk simply wandered into a random mall, seeking respite from the demands of his life? It was impossible to know. But what was clear in that moment was the undeniable shift in the air. This wasn't just a man shopping for electronics. This was something far more compelling, a figure of notoriety who had walked in, unnoticed at first, but was now a spectacle to everyone around him. And as he continued to drift through the mall, unchallenged and yet the subject of everyone's thoughts, it seemed that this ordinary Saturday would not soon be forgotten. John Whitaker stood at the front of his office, carefully running his hands over the edges of the polished wooden desk, his mind shifting between two realities. On one side of the room, the quiet hum of a busy mall played through his office's intercom, the typical soundscape of Oakwood Plaza, the clattering of shoes on tile, the faint murmur of shoppers making their weekend purchases, the occasional laughter of children darting by. Yet, on the other side of the office, a different reality loomed. It was the reality of responsibility, the reality of rules, of policies that governed every inch of the sprawling space that he was tasked with overseeing. Oakwood Plaza, a hub for Lexington's families and tourists, had been meticulously designed to be a neutral space, a haven free from the harsh realities of the outside world. He, as the mall manager, had made sure that this ethos ran through every aspect of the plaza's operations. It was his job to ensure that everyone felt welcome, comfortable, and most importantly safe from the divisiveness that often pervaded public spaces. He had just finished a meeting with his team, the morning's usual business run through. Everything was in order, as it always was. Yet, as he straightened a stack of papers on his desk, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere that didn't belong. There was a faint disturbance, something was off, and it wasn't just the usual mall bustle. He could feel it like a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Something had happened, something he needed to address, even if he didn't yet know what it was. His phone buzzed on the desk, its vibrations sudden and insistent. John glanced at the screen, seeing Nancy's name flashing. She was one of his senior security supervisors, known for her calm under pressure and her precise handling of tricky situations. He answered it, without hesitation. The urgency in her voice was immediate. "John, you need to come out here. We've got a bit of a situation." He didn't need to ask for clarification. The tone in her voice told him everything. He pushed back his chair, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "What kind of situation?" he asked, his voice already tinged with the professional calm that he had honed over the years. "I don't know how to explain it over the phone," Nancy replied, her voice strained. Well, Elon Musk is here." The words hit John like a sharp jolt. Elon Musk? What on earth would the billionaire CEO of Tesla and SpaceX be doing here in Oakwood Plaza? The confusion clouded his mind for a brief moment, but his instincts quickly kicked in. He knew the mall had a strict policy against any sort of political displays or public figures making a spectacle of themselves. Musk's presence, coupled with the infamous MAGA hat he was reportedly wearing, was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. It was a recipe for disruption, and it needed to be handled carefully before the situation spiraled out of control. "Okay, I'll be right there," John said, cutting the call. His mind raced as he made his way out of the office and down the hall toward the main floor. The moment he stepped into the atrium, the sounds of the crowd intensified, a buzz that wasn't typical of a Saturday afternoon. The usual soft chatter and laughter were now punctuated by louder voices, speculative, curious, and increasingly anxious. John moved quickly, his eyes scanning the crowd. There, standing near the electronics kiosk, was the unmistakable figure of a man in a red MAGA hat. His posture was relaxed, but there was no mistaking the magnetism of his presence. A small crowd had already gathered, phones raised in the air, snapping pictures, recording every second of the bizarre spectacle unfolding before them. The sight unsettled John. As mall manager, it was his responsibility to maintain the peace and ensure that no one felt uncomfortable or excluded. The sight of a political symbol, particularly one as divisive as the MAGA hat, had no place here. There were already people in the crowd whispering in hushed tones, some expressing approval, others dismay. He could feel the undercurrent of tension building, as if at any moment it might erupt. He knew he had to act quickly. With steady strides, John approached the small crowd, trying to push through the cluster of onlookers without drawing too much attention. His eyes locked onto the man in the red hat, whose face was obscured by dark sunglasses. Even from a distance, there was something striking about him, an aura of authority that seemed to hold the crowd at bay without him even trying. John's footsteps echoed sharply against the tiled floor as he drew closer. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd growing louder now, and it was clear that they were all waiting for something to happen. The tension was palpable. He reached the edge of the crowd and cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the growing hush. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice firm but polite, trying to maintain a sense of control despite the situation spiraling out of his grasp. The man in the red hat didn't turn right away, as if the interruption was an inconvenience he had anticipated but was unwilling to engage with just yet. John waited a beat, and when the man finally looked up, he was struck by the familiarity of his face. The resemblance was uncanny. This man, whether or not he was actually Elon Musk, carried an undeniable air of confidence that spoke volumes. He was no stranger to being in the public eye. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove that hat," John said, his tone shifting to one of mild authority. "We have a strict policy about maintaining a neutral environment here. No political attire." The man's eyes locked onto his. They were piercing, sharp, the kind of eyes that made John feel as though he was being assessed in ways he couldn't quite understand. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem particularly bothered. Instead, there was a slight curve at the edges of his mouth, a small, knowing smile that suggested an underlying amusement. John's stomach tightened. He had faced difficult situations before, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about enforcing a policy, it was about facing something he couldn't quite grasp. Why wasn't the man reacting as expected? Why wasn't he intimidated by the idea of being asked to leave? "I'm afraid I can't do that," the man said, his voice calm and steady, almost soothing in its deliberate indifference to the chaos around them. His refusal was simple, direct, and oddly defiant. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move. John's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in, the growing scrutiny of the onlookers, their cameras trained on him. This wasn't just a request for compliance, it had become a public spectacle. He couldn't back down now. So John said, trying to maintain his composure, "If you don't comply, I will have no choice but to ask security to escort you from the premises." The man didn't move, didn't react. His posture remained relaxed, his expression unreadable. And yet there was an unmistakable sense of challenge in his eyes, a quiet resistance that seemed to say, "Go ahead." It was a gamble, but John wasn't about to let this escalate any further. He reached for his radio, his fingers shaking slightly as he called for additional security. He could already hear the murmurs of discontent rising from the crowd, the mixed reactions from the people who had gathered around. This wasn't just about enforcing mall policy anymore, it had become something far larger, something with a life of its own. John stood there, waiting for backup, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. The crowd, still unsure of what was unfolding, continued to watch, some recording every moment, others debating among themselves. He had become part of the spectacle, the very thing he had worked his entire career to avoid. Yet there was no turning back now. The arrival of the security guards, tall and burly, brought a temporary shift in the crowd's energy. One of the guards, Eric, took his position beside John, his expression stern. The other, a younger guard named Mia, stood slightly behind, her eyes flicking nervously from John to the man in the red hat. The tension had thickened to an almost unbearable point. John's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd once again, but this time there was less politeness and more authority. "This is your final warning," he said, his gaze never leaving the man. "Remove the hat or leave the mall." The man's gaze softened just a touch, as if considering something, and then he spoke again, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, John realized the impossible truth. This wasn't just about a hat or a policy anymore. It was about a confrontation, one that no amount of rules or regulations could contain. It was a battle of wills, and he wasn't sure which side would win. The atmosphere inside Oakwood Plaza shifted drastically as the security team, led by Eric and Mia, positioned themselves around the man in the red MAGA hat. The scene had gone from a mild curiosity to something much more intense. John Whittaker, the mall manager, stood to the side, his eyes scanning the crowd as the murmurs intensified. People were recording the encounter on their phones, whispering among themselves, some clearly enjoying the spectacle, while others seemed uncomfortable with the tension in the air. Eric, a veteran of the security team, was the first to approach the situation with a calm demeanor, his large frame cutting through the crowd with ease. His experience in handling unruly situations, ranging from shoplifters to rowdy teens, had prepared him for just about anything. However, even he could feel the undercurrent of unease as he moved in. The man in the red hat stood unmoving, his posture relaxed, almost as if daring the situation to escalate. Mia, younger and newer to the team, stayed slightly behind Eric, her nerves showing in the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. This was the type of situation she had hoped to avoid when she signed up for mall security. The tension was palpable, and she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her. Her hand hovered near her radio, ready to call for backup if things escalated further, though she hoped it wouldn't come to that. Eric took a deep breath and addressed the man in the red hat, his voice steady and calm. His job was to de-escalate, to remove the tension, and to avoid any physical confrontation if at all possible. He had seen enough situations like this to know that keeping a cool head was the only way forward. The crowd, which had been murmuring just a moment ago, had quieted down, and all eyes were now fixed on the scene unfolding in front of them. The man in the red hat didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, looking at Eric with an unreadable expression. There was something about the way he carried himself, so sure, so unbothered, that unsettled Eric. Normally, people reacted to authority with at least a hint of hesitation or compliance. Not this man. His stance was firm, his hands at his sides, and his sunglasses gave him an air of complete detachment. It was as if he knew exactly what kind of spectacle he was creating and was content to let it play out. Eric, unwilling to let the situation linger any longer, took another step forward. He tried to be as non-threatening as possible, aware that every movement was being watched. He glanced briefly at Mia, who was still standing behind him, her hand gripping her radio tightly. She seemed ready to spring into action at any moment, though Eric hoped it wouldn't be necessary. He had seen too many situations escalate because of a lack of patience. "We're going to need you to leave the premises," Sir Eric said again, his voice calm but authoritative. "Please remove the hat and head toward the exit. There's no need for this to get any more complicated." The man in the red hat didn't flinch. He seemed to consider Eric's words for a moment, his expression unreadable behind his dark sunglasses. The crowd around them had grown quieter, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. People were watching, waiting for something to happen, and Eric could feel the weight of their expectations. They wanted a resolution, and quickly. The man took a step back, as if to make space, and then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat, pulling it down further over his brow. It was a subtle defiance, a move that made the crowd buzz again. A few people gasped, others murmured in disbelief. Eric's patience was wearing thin. The longer this dragged on, the more unpredictable the situation became. "Sir, you need to come with me now," Eric said, his tone growing firmer. "You're in violation of mall policy. If you don't comply, we will have to ask you to leave forcibly." At this point, Mia stepped forward, her hand now fully gripping the radio. She didn't like where this was heading. The crowd had shifted. Some people were now cheering the man in the red hat. Others were looking increasingly uncomfortable. They were trapped in the middle of a volatile situation, and everyone knew it. The man finally spoke, but his words were almost drowned out by the growing murmur of the crowd. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, his voice carrying an air of finality. He didn't seem to fear the consequences of his defiance. Eric's muscles tensed, his hand instinctively going to the walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He'd been in plenty of difficult situations, but something about this felt different. He wasn't just dealing with a disgruntled shopper or a troublesome teen. This was a confrontation, a challenge to his authority and the very policies he was paid to uphold. "We're going to give you one last chance to leave," Sir Eric said, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "If you refuse again, we will be forced to take you into custody." For a brief moment, it seemed like the man was going to comply. He lifted his hand slowly, as if considering his next move. The crowd held its breath, waiting for him to finally walk away. But instead of removing his hat or even turning toward the exit, the man simply leaned back slightly, his posture casual, and crossed his arms. His sunglasses remained firmly in place. Eric exchanged a glance with Mia. They had no choice now. If the man refused to comply with their instructions, they had to enforce the mall's policy, no matter how high-profile or controversial the situation had become. Eric nodded to Mia, who immediately turned and made a call over the radio for backup. The situation had escalated beyond their ability to handle alone, and they needed more security to manage the crowd. As she spoke into the radio, Eric stepped forward again, his voice now colder, more resolute. "I'm giving you one last warning," Eric said, his hand moving slightly to his belt, where he kept his handcuffs. "Leave now, or we will be forced to escort you out of the building." The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. He seemed almost amused by the situation. The crowd was watching closely, some hoping for confrontation, others hoping for a peaceful resolution. But no one knew which way this would go. Mia's voice crackled over the radio. "We need backup. Now." Eric's focus was completely on the man in front of him. He had seen how these things could spiral out of control, and he wasn't about to let that happen today. He was aware of the eyes on him, some hopeful, some skeptical, and he had no intention of losing control of the situation. For a split second, everything seemed to pause. The man in the red hat, the crowd, and even Eric felt like they were frozen in time. Then the tension broke when the sound of heavy footsteps approached. The backup security team arrived, two more officers who immediately took their positions behind Eric and Mia. The presence of additional security guards, tall and confident, seemed to shift the atmosphere, and the crowd instinctively quieted, the dynamic subtly changing as they watched the new arrivals take their places. The man's eyes flicked to the new security guards, then back to Eric. The weight of the situation hung in the air. The man might not have been afraid, but it was clear that he understood the game was changing. He no longer had the freedom to refuse and stand his ground without consequences. Eric's patience finally wore thin. With a nod from the backup guards, Eric stepped forward and placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive move, but one that clearly signaled the end of any leniency. The man tensed for a moment, but didn't resist as Eric guided him toward the exit. As they moved through the crowd, the people parted to let them pass. The spectacle had come to an end, though the lingering tension in the air would not dissipate so easily. The crowd had barely begun to settle when the moment of truth arrived, when the man in the red MAGA hat, whose presence had ignited such a charged scene, finally revealed his true identity. The mall, a typical suburban shopping center that had seen its fair share of oddities, had never experienced anything quite like this. The tension that had been building for the past several minutes seemed to peak, and then, without warning, the man in the red hat spoke, his voice piercing through the murmur of the crowd, cutting through the silence that had enveloped the space. Eric, who had been guiding him toward the exit with a firm but calm grip on his shoulder, felt the shift before he heard the words. It wasn't just the change in the man's tone, it was the way the air around them seemed to crackle with something else. The crowd, which had been watching this moment with a mix of curiosity and expectation, began to shift in energy once more, their attention laser-focused on what was unfolding. At first, the words seemed innocuous. The man's voice was steady, and though the statement itself didn't carry any obvious weight, something about it felt off. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it. The man in the red hat, whose defiance had been the centerpiece of this entire episode, casually lowered his sunglasses to reveal his eyes. It was an innocuous gesture, one that many people made without a second thought, but in this case it caused a ripple effect. As the crowd's whispers grew louder, Eric felt his own pulse quicken. He had been trained to deal with difficult situations, to remain calm under pressure, but the sheer unpredictability of this moment was unlike anything he had experienced in his years of security work. He was no longer just dealing with a disruptive mall-goer, he was facing someone who, for reasons he couldn't yet fathom, was willing to drag out the tension, to manipulate the scene to their advantage. The man in the red hat took a slow step back, pulling away from Eric's guiding hand, and then he made the declaration that would change everything. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It wasn't even about the defiance or the tension he had generated. It was about who he was. The crowd quieted almost instantly, as if the realization of what was happening sent a shockwave through them. It was a subtle shift, a quiet gasp from someone at the front, followed by the sound of a phone camera clicking on as people tried to capture the moment. The man in the red MAGA hat wasn't just some random individual, he was someone who, even in this small, everyday setting, had an undeniable presence. His next words, spoken slowly, methodically, and with a weight that no one had expected, confirmed it. "I'm James Spencer," he said, his voice carrying through the mall with surprising authority. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. The name hung in the air, and for those who recognized it, it was as if a veil had been lifted. There was a collective pause, a split second of disbelief, as people processed what had just been revealed. Eric's grip on the man's shoulder tightened, though not out of aggression, but out of sheer confusion. James Spencer. The name resonated with a few in the crowd, while others were left to wonder if they should have recognized it too. James Spencer was not just any name. He was known in certain circles as an influential entrepreneur with connections to various high-profile ventures. He had been part of the tech world for years, his name floating in the news now and then, usually tied to ambitious startups, radical innovations, or controversial investments. Spencer had built a reputation for being a maverick, someone who wasn't afraid to take risks and challenge norms. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a controversial figure who thrived on disruption. The crowd, initially divided between the curious and the skeptical, now buzzed with new energy. Phones were raised, cameras pointed directly at him as the recognition sank in. James Spencer wasn't just a figurehead in a distant, high-profile world, he was standing in the middle of their everyday lives. Here, in this suburban mall, he was as tangible as the sneakers on the shelves and the food court trays on the tables. The juxtaposition of his fame and his current situation felt surreal. Eric was still processing this new information when the mall manager, John Whittaker, stepped forward. He had been watching the scene unfold from a distance, his mind working quickly to piece together the new puzzle before him. The moment the name was spoken, he knew there would be no simple resolution. James Spencer's identity didn't just complicate matters, it changed the entire nature of the situation. Whittaker's gaze flicked between the crowd, still divided and murmuring, and the man now standing before him, unperturbed, almost amused by the reactions he was drawing. Spencer's calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing tension in the room, and Whittaker knew that the perception of this event had just shifted entirely. Eric had seen people try to play the "do you know who I am" card before, but this was different. Spencer wasn't just some self-important individual, he was a legitimate public figure, one whose actions could sway opinions and news coverage. The stakes had just risen considerably. Mia, who had been standing off to the side, watching the scene with growing unease, knew that her role had just changed. What was once a simple mall security issue was now teetering on the edge of something much more complex. She glanced at her radio, fingers still hovering over the button for backup, but in this moment she felt helpless. There was nothing in her training that had prepared her for dealing with someone of Spencer's caliber. Spencer stood there, seemingly oblivious to the chaos he had sparked, his arms casually folded over his chest. His eyes scanned the crowd, as if waiting for them to process what had just been revealed. He wasn't looking for sympathy or understanding, if anything, he was savoring the reaction. The confusion, the awe, the unease, it was all part of the game for him. What no one could have anticipated was the ripple effect his identity would have on the rest of the mall. As soon as the realization hit, it was as if a switch had been flipped in the atmosphere. The people around him began to react differently, some now treating him with a newfound respect, others with wariness. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Spencer's revelation didn't just affect the crowd. It affected Eric and Mia too. Suddenly, they weren't dealing with a disruptive individual, they were dealing with someone who was untouchable, someone whose actions could reverberate far beyond the walls of the Oakwood Plaza. Eric could sense the shift in his own demeanor. What had started as a routine security issue had now turned into something with much greater consequences. And despite the momentary sense of victory that came with Spencer's compliance in not resisting, Eric knew that his job had just become far more complicated. John Whittaker, the mall manager, stepped in, attempting to regain control over the situation. He approached Spencer, his demeanor respectful, though tinged with the realization that this moment could spiral into something neither he nor anyone else had been prepared for. Spencer had no reason to be intimidated. After all, he was a man who had made a career out of upsetting norms and challenging expectations, and he was well aware of the power his presence now commanded. The rest of the crowd watched in suspense, phones still raised, eager to capture every moment. The person they had thought was just another angry shopper had suddenly become a larger-than-life figure, a man whose identity had shaken the very foundations of this mundane moment, transforming it into an event that would be remembered for a long time to come. As the scene unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just about a mall dispute or a man in a hat anymore. This was about power, who held it, who didn't, and how easily it could shift in the blink of an eye. Kaylee had always been the quiet one in her group of friends, the type of person who observed more than she spoke. She was the kind of person who knew how to blend into the background, making her presence known only when it was absolutely necessary. But despite her tendency to stay out of the spotlight, something about the incident at Oakwood Plaza had drawn her into the center of it. It had started as a typical afternoon. Kaylee had planned to spend a few hours at the mall, something to take her mind off the stress of school and life in general. She wandered aimlessly through the aisles of stores, browsing items she didn't need but would buy if she could. She wasn't in a hurry, just enjoying the anonymity of the crowd. Being alone among so many people gave her a strange comfort, as if she could be herself without anyone expecting anything of her. That's when she saw him. At first, it was just a flash of red, a guy in a MAGA hat, standing at the edge of the food court, his posture rigid and confrontational. Kaylee didn't think much of it. People wore strange things in malls all the time. But as she walked past him, something in the air felt different. There was a palpable tension, something on the verge of erupting, but Kaylee couldn't put her finger on it. She tried to ignore it, walking a little faster, but she couldn't shake the feeling. The man's presence had a ripple effect. The atmosphere shifted around him, and she could feel the unease building as she moved further away. It was the sound of raised voices, then silence, and then the chaos that followed. Before she knew it, the mall had erupted into action. Security had surrounded the man, who was now being escorted out, but not before a small group of bystanders began recording the scene on their phones. The tension in the air thickened, a combination of curiosity, anger, and confusion. People whispered and murmured, some wondering what had set the man off, others trying to piece together what had happened. But Kaylee, who had instinctively retreated to the back of the crowd, wasn't just an observer. She had seen something that no one else had noticed. As she watched the scene unfold, her mind flashed back to something she had overheard earlier that day, an argument between two strangers in a coffee shop nearby, something about tech investments and the fall of a startup. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but now, as the man in the red hat made his dramatic reveal, a part of her connected the dots. James Spencer. The name struck her like a thunderclap, and the realization hit her with an unexpected weight. It was only in that moment, as the crowd buzzed around her, that Kaylee fully understood what she had witnessed. The man she had just brushed past, someone whose presence had sent the crowd into a frenzy, wasn't just a random individual. He was someone who had left a mark on the world. Kaylee didn't know why she felt compelled to make sense of it all, but somehow she couldn't shake the pull of the story unfolding before her. She was no longer just a passerby, she had witnessed something that could very well make headlines. Her mind raced as she left the mall that day. She wasn't sure if she was drawn to the drama of it, or if something deeper had shifted in her. Kaylee had never been one to actively chase after excitement, but in that moment it felt as though the excitement had found her. It was as if her own quiet life had collided with a story far larger than anything she had anticipated. What she didn't realize at the time was that this event, this moment, would come to define her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. It wasn't just about James Spencer or the chaos in the mall, it was about how, For the first time, Kaylee felt like she had a piece of the story. It was a story that could change everything. The moment when Elon Musk turned from a figure of controversy into an embodiment of compassion was subtle, yet powerful. As the chaos in the mall shifted from confusion to something more profound, there was an unmistakable energy in the air. It was as if the very fabric of the situation had been transformed by an unexpected turn of events. People who had been recording the confrontation now found themselves standing still, phones forgotten in their hands, captivated by what was unfolding before them. Musk's demeanor had changed. The defiance he had shown earlier had softened, replaced by an almost quiet sincerity. He was no longer just a billionaire tech mogul, caught up in a spectacle. He was a person addressing something far more human. As Kaylee stepped forward, still uncertain, he made a gesture that would resonate with everyone in that crowd. He took out an envelope, its crisp edges catching the light of the fluorescent mall lamps, and handed it to her without fanfare or grandiosity. The gesture itself wasn't about the money it never had been. It was about seeing beyond the surface, about recognizing that beneath the complex layers of personal struggles, financial burdens, and dreams yet to be realized, there was a person who needed help. Kaylee, overwhelmed by the moment, took the envelope with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the cold, impersonal paper. Her heart was pounding, her mind racing, and she could barely comprehend what was happening. It was surreal, as though the world had slowed around her, the sound of the crowd muffled by the thudding of her pulse. When she opened it and saw the check inside, everything shifted. The sum was staggering, more than she could have ever imagined in her wildest dreams. The room seemed to close in on her as she read the number, and her mind refused to accept it at first. Was it real? Did this really just happen? The tears that had been threatening to spill over the edge of her composure finally broke free, streaking down her cheeks as her hands shook uncontrollably. In that brief moment, the mall transformed from a bustling shopping center into something sacred. The noise of the crowd faded into the background, and all that remained was a profound sense of connection. This wasn't just about a check, it was about someone who had chosen to see her, truly see her, and offer a lifeline when it seemed like the world had closed all the doors. Musk hadn't come to the mall for attention or publicity. He had come because he saw the potential in Kaylee's story, in her struggle, and in her dreams for something more than just survival. For the first time in a long while, Kaylee allowed herself to feel the weight of that kindness. She had spent so much time fighting to make ends meet, carrying the burden of her family's financial struggles on her shoulders. For years, she had been afraid to ask for help, to even admit that she needed it. But this moment, the way the world had shifted around her, made her realize that there was no shame in accepting help, in receiving a gift given with no strings attached. The crowd around her had begun to soften too. The harsh judgments that had once lingered in the air seemed to dissolve, replaced by something warmer. Some people in the crowd wiped away their own tears, while others clapped, celebrating not the spectacle of a famous figure, but the authenticity of what had just transpired. Even John, who had stood rigidly by the rules of the mall, felt something stir in him. The weight of the situation had shifted, from a corporate policy enforcer to a person witnessing an act of humanity. As Kaylee stood there, still processing the enormity of what had just happened, she realized something fundamental. This gesture was not just about the financial assistance, nor was it just about a wealthy man choosing to help a stranger. It was a reminder that, in a world that often felt disconnected, there were still moments of profound connection and compassion. And for Kaylee, this gesture had given her more than money. It had given her a sense of hope, something that had been scarce in her life for far too long. Elon Musk's gesture wasn't just about philanthropy, it was about changing the way people saw one another. It was about taking the time to acknowledge that, no matter how different they seemed, everyone had their own battles, their own dreams, and their own moments of vulnerability. In that quiet, unspoken exchange, Musk had invited everyone around him to think differently, to question their assumptions, and to see the humanity in each other. And for Kaylee, it was a pivotal moment, one that would not only change her life but would echo in her heart for years to come.